Chapter 16. Now I actually had to fill a sack with milkweed pods, which took longer than I liked, but I remembered myself that while Toby might need me, so did the troops. I pictured a boy lost in a stormy sea, his life jacket keeping him above water until he could be rescued. A life jacket filled with milkweed floss from our farm, perhaps from the sack over my shoulder. I picked until my fingers were sore and the sack overflowing. Alongside the grassy lane between the barn and the house there was a wagon where I spread the pods on a workbench to dry, said hello to the cat snapping in the wagon bed, and went on my regular chores, long overdue on this very odd day. First, I gathered eggs from the kitchen coop, a nice place in cool weather, awful in the heat. Our birds were accustomed to me and didn't raise a fuss, even when I reached underneath them to take their warm eggs, leaving some with the brood hens so we would always have young birds coming of age to replace those we ate. Of all my chores, the worst was plucking a chicken after my mother had wrung its neck and dunked it in boiling water. For the dozen eggs in my basket, I thanked the birds with corn and dried marigolds and left them in peace. At the well by the house, which had a proper housing so it was safe and neat enough for my mother's liking, I washed the eggs under the pump and carried them inside. Good girl, my grandmother said after I took off my boots and put the eggs in a bowl by the stove. I went up to my room and stripped off some of the layers I'd worn for the early morning warmth, changed my damp socks for dry ones, and ran a brush through my hair. Back in the kitchen, I helped my mother and grandmother with a huge pot of soup. We had no idea when the searchers would return or how many would come back with my father for a hot meal. So we browned onions and stewing beef, added vegetables and tomato juice my mother had put up in August, and left the pot to simmer. My mother checked my hands to make sure they were clean enough, and then she set a huge bowl on the kitchen table, took off the damp linen that covered it, and let me punch down the dough that had risen into a soft white belly. We all three twisted off dollops to shape into rolls, lined them up on greased pans, and slid them into the oven. In no time, the kitchen was so fragrant with soup, at the simmer, and browning rolls that I was hungry all over again. I could only imagine how Toby must have felt. Go on now and red up your room, Annabelle, my mother said, which I did in a trice, making my bed and putting away the clothes I'd shed. On second thought, I pulled the case from my pillow and spread the quilt over it again. Then I went hunting. From the room where my brothers slept, I took Treasure Island, which my grandmother had just read to them for the third time and wouldn't be wanting again for a long while. I put it in the pillowcase. From my parents' room, I took an old pair of my father's pants, a soft flannel shirt much like every other one he owned, some thick socks, and a pair of skivvies. In the past, my mother had given identical ones to Toby, so these were perfect. From my mother's sewing kit, I borrowed her sharpest scissors. All of this went into the pillowcase, along with a bar of lava soap and a clean towel from the washroom. At every turn, I was but steps from my mother or grandmother, but they were busy and I was soft-footed as I took the pillowcase down to the cellar and left it just outside the door behind a bush. When I returned to the kitchen, I found my mother making pies. I want to search too, I said. She turned from her work, hands white with flour. Oh, Annabelle, I don't think that's a good idea. But when your father comes back with the boys, you can ask him. I expect your brothers will be happy to stay home after a morning tramping through wet woods. Maybe you can take their place. All I'd really wanted was a reason to take a jar of soup and some rolls and head back out again. And now here I might have talked myself into an afternoon searching for a girl who had made a mess of things for everyone. All right, I said slowly, but no one's looking right around here. Why don't I go on a little walk through the woods back of the barn? I could take my lunch with me. I won't go far. My mother considered me for a moment. Do you know more about this than you're telling me, Annabelle? I forced myself to hold her gaze. More about what? About Betty gone missing? By now she had turned fully toward me, her flowery hands poised in the air as if she were about to lead a choir. The truth suited, though. It was a lie, too. And once again, I knew I would not be able to keep my secret for much longer. Nope, I said, I have no idea where she is, but I'd like to help find her. My mother nodded thoughtfully. All right, take what you want and go on out, but not off our hill, do you understand? Yes, ma'am, I said. I chose a coat with deep pockets, and when I put a mason jar filled with hot soup wrapped in a dishcloth and a spoon. In the other, a hot roll with a coin of butter tucked inside, the hole pinned shut. Wrapped in a sheet of wax paper. You look like you've got jodhpurs on, my mother said as I stood by the door ready to go. What are jodhpurs? I said. Never mind, just watch yourself, Annabelle, and don't go too far. When you hear the dinner bell, you'll know your father's back." "Yes, ma'am," I said again. "And take that egg basket back out to the coop," she said. "Yes, ma'am," which was one "yes, ma'am" too many. My mother bent a little to look straight into my face. "What are you not telling me?" she said, not angry, but plenty serious. I looked steadily back at her. "I'm afraid," I said. I didn't know where that came from. It just came, and it was the truth. She straightened up. "Of what?" I shrugged. Everything. Betty missing, Toby missing, what Aunt Lily said about Toby taking Betty prisoner, the police coming here. I've never even seen a policeman. And then I was crying. And I was more surprised about it than my mother, who bent down again and put her arms around me and made soft noises in my ear. "It's all right, Annabelle, it's all right. Everything will be all right." Which was what I had said to Toby, whether I believed it or not. I hope my mother believed it, but I had learned over the past weeks that believing in something doesn't always make it so. I wiped my eyes and put on my cap. "I don't know what that was all about," I said. "I'm not really very scared. I just wish they would find Betty so things could get back to normal." My mother smiled at me. "Me too. Now go on and have a look around, but remember what I said about staying close by." When she turned back to her work, I said, "What would you say if I asked you to make a hickory nut pie?" We had a few hickory trees and harvested enough for our own use, but the nuts were dear and generally meant for holidays. She picked up her rolling pin. "I would say that you might expect something of the kind before long. Don't forget to ring the bell when they get back," I said. I went out the door, down and around the back of the house, fetched the pillowcase, and swung it over one shoulder, feeling a little like a hobo. I headed down farther into the trees and across the side of the wooded hill below the barn until I had worked my way around the back of it and could enter again unseen from the house or the lane. The horses watched me cross the pasture, ready for an apple if I had one, but I paid them no mind, and after a moment they returned to their grazing. "Me again," I called as I climbed the ladder to the hayloft. This time Toby had come out of his hiding place to meet me. "I didn't expect you back so soon," he said. "I brought some more food. When everybody comes in from searching, I'll have to go back, and I may not be out here again for a while." I emptied my pockets of the soup and bread, handed Toby the spoon. "Lunch," I said. Watching Toby eat that soup and bread was a little like watching somebody pray. He made it last, dipping the spoon slowly into the mason jar, and then, toward the end, tipping the dregs into his mouth. When he bit into the roll and found the surprise of soft butter inside, he laughed. Just one quick burst. He seemed as startled by that as I was. I'd not heard him laugh before, nor seen him smile. He finished the roll, capped the jar, and set it aside. "Thank you," he said. "You're welcome." He gestured at the pillowcase. "What have you got there?" I knelt and opened it, pulling out the book. "Well, this is Treasure Island." I held it out. The book was soft from handling, its corners stubbed, but Toby wiped his hands carefully on his pant legs before he reached for it. "Thank you," he said. "You're welcome," I replied. "There's a big hatch behind those bells for lowering them out to the pasture. You can open one of the shutters and get some light to read by." Toby nodded. "Can I ask you something?" I said. He raised his eyebrows. "You just did." I smiled and popped a fist against my forehead. "Okay, here." I paused. And here I paused, suddenly afraid. "I like your hair and all. I like it very much. It's very nice hair." "Thank you," he said again, puzzled. "Is that a question?" I used to have long hair like that, but I hated when I got rats in it, and my mother would about snap my neck trying to comb it out. He waited. "And then my Aunt Lily cut it short one morning when I came in from chores with chicken feathers in my braids. My mother about had a seizure, but in the end she liked it better. Said I looked like Amelia Earhart." Toby nodded. "You do a little. And I wondered if you might let me give you a trim. I brought some scissors just in case, but I like your hair very much, Toby. It's nice hair." I felt like an idiot. Toby pulled a hank around and looked at how long it was. "Keeps me warm in the winter," he said. I nodded. "I'll knit you a scarf instead." I would have to learn to knit first, but he didn't know that. "Why? Why should you cut your hair?" He nodded. "Same reason I think you should trim your beard," I said, "so you'll feel tidy." I like to feel tidy. I like how light I feel. I shook my head. Nothing to get in my eyes. Tidy. Which was the truth. What I didn't say was that his hair and his beard hid him too much, as if he were peeking out from somewhere inside himself. "And then," I added, before I lost my nerve, "you can have a good wash under the pump and put on some fresh things." I pulled the soap and towel and clothes out of the pillowcase and set them on a bale of hay. I stood back and waited. "Am I too dirty?" he asked. He held out his hands in front of him. It took me It hurt me to look at the scarred one, how it was puckered and gnarled. No, not at all. I'm sorry, Toby, I said. I don't mean it that at all. Just that it will feel good to be, well, tidy, he said. Yes, I said, tidy. I thought that if I said the word tidy one more time, he would pick me up and pitch me out of the loft. But after a bit, he nodded and said, if you think so. We started with the hair. First, I cut off most of it in big hunks and put them in a pile to bury in the woods later. With the worst of it gone, I set to making it even, tidy, which I was ill-equipped to do. But I'd watched my mother trim up my brothers and knew essentially how it should be done. I was glad, though, that I hadn't brought a mirror. When I was finished, Toby looked astonishingly unlike Toby. You look like your own brother, I said, meaning a version of himself. Toby looked at me quite seriously. I don't have a brother. Sister? He shook his head. I paused, bit back my curiosity. Now the beard, I said. Toby jerked his head back. Not too short, he said. I nodded. Don't worry. But before I could begin, I heard the dinner bell ringing hard back at the house. Uh-oh, I said, handing him the scissors. My father's home. You have to do the beard yourself. He stood up suddenly. Will you let me know if they found her? I will, I said, but be careful now. I returned the soup jar and spoon to my pocket. I don't know who might come out here next. Hide all the rest of this behind the bills, okay? I'll be back as soon as I can. This time, when I looked back up from the threshing floor, Toby was peering over the loft rail. If I hadn't known it was him, I wouldn't have recognized Toby looking down at me. He was that different, shorn.